Her hands, chapped and smelling of brine, were the truest story of her life, a life measured in the pre-dawn chill off the Gulf. If you believe the quiet strength of working women deserves a powerful voice, consider supporting our mission with a super thanks. And if you stand with her simple, profound courage, leave an Amara, your heart is your strength, in the comments below. Amara's world was a small, fiercely defended territory of water, salt, and routine. It began each day at 4 in the morning, when the darkness over Port Caille, Louisiana, was still absolute, a thick, velvet curtain yet to be torn by the sun. She would rise in her small shotgun shack, a home that was more a collection of sturdy, weathered boards than a proper house, and the first thing she would do was put a kettle on her small gas stove. The hiss of the gas and the eventual whistle of the kettle were the opening notes of her daily symphony of survival. The rest of the composition was written in the scent of briny air, the groan of wooden docks, the slap of wet fish on ice, and the ache in her lower back that was as constant as the tide. She was a fish seller, just as her father had been, and his father before him. The Devereaux Fish Stall, a small open-air counter at the edge of the town's bustling seafood market, was her inheritance, a legacy not of wealth, but of relentless, back-breaking labor. Her hands told the story. The palms were a calloused geography of her 30 years, scarred with the faint, silvery lines of errant oyster shells and the deep, ingrained grime of her trade that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. She was poor, a fact as plain and unadorned as the simple wooden cross that hung on her wall. But she was not broken. There was a fierce, quiet dignity to Amara, a self-possessed stillness that she had inherited from a long line of people who had learned to weather storms, both literal and metaphorical. She moved with an economy of motion that wasted no energy. She spoke with a directness that wasted no words. The other vendors at the market respected her. The fishermen who sold her their catch knew she was a shrewd but fair negotiator. The wealthy tourists who sometimes wandered down to the docks from the town's more polished, historic quarter saw her as a piece of local color, a rustic figure to be photographed, never realizing that the quiet, observant woman gutting a redfish with practiced, surgical precision was possessed of a spirit more resilient than the hulls of the shrimp boats that crowded the harbor. She was, in her own small way, a queen in a kingdom of ice and scales, and she asked for nothing from no one. The day it happened began like any other. The morning rush had been good, the afternoon lull long and hot. Now, as the sun began its slow, spectacular descent into the Gulf, casting long, orange-tinted shadows across the docks, a storm was rolling in. Amara could feel it in the air, a sudden drop in temperature and a heavy electric stillness that promised violence. The sky to the west was the color of a deep bruise. Most of the other vendors had already packed up, eager to get home before the heavens opened. Amara was finishing her cleanup, her movements methodical, scraping the last of the fish scales from the wooden counter, hosing down the concrete floor until it was clean. She was tired. The thought of her small, quiet house, a bowl of hot gumbo, and a book was a powerful lure. She was just about to pull the heavy wooden shutters across the front of her stall when a sound made her freeze. It was not a sound that belonged to the docks. It was a harsh, ragged gasp for air, followed by a low groan of pure agony. It came from the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran between her stall and the old ice house. Her first instinct, the one honed by a lifetime of being a woman alone in a rough place, was to ignore it. Trouble lived in alleys. Nothing good ever came out of them. She reached for the shutter, her jaw tight. But then the sound came again, weaker this time, a desperate liquid rattle. It was the sound of a living thing drowning, not in water, but in its own blood. The fisherman's daughter in her, the part of her that could not abide seeing any creature suffer in a net, overrode the cautious, sensible woman. With her heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm against her ribs, she took the heavy iron fish gaff she kept for protection and moved slowly toward the mouth of the alley. He was crumpled at the base of a stack of rotting wooden pallets, a heap of darkness in the deeper shadows. He was a large man, a black man, and he was dressed in the tattered remains of what looked like military-style fatigues, but it was the blood that held her gaze. A dark, ugly stain was was spreading across his side and thigh, so dark it was almost black in the failing light. His face was turned away from her, pressed against the damp brick wall, his body racked with shudders. He was a soldier, that much was clear, but there was no war in Port Caille. There were only shrimpers, tourists, and the quiet, simmering resentments of a small southern town. Every rational instinct screamed at her to back away slowly, to go to the sheriff's office, to let the authorities handle this. He was clearly in some kind of deep, violent trouble. Helping him would be like inviting the storm that was brewing out on the Gulf directly into her small, carefully ordered life. The risks were immense. A wounded black man, the police, questions she couldn't answer. It was a recipe for disaster. She stood there, frozen, her knuckles white on the handle of the fish gaff. He must have sensed her presence, because he tried to push himself up, his movements agonizingly slow. He turned his head, and for the first time she saw his face. It was a strong face, carved from hardship, but his eyes were what broke through her fear. They were filled with a desperate, hunted animal terror, but beneath it there was a core of fierce, unyielding pride. He was not begging for help. He was trying to get up, to keep moving, to fight on, even though his body had clearly betrayed him. In that moment, he was not a threat. He was not a problem for the authorities. He was just a man, wounded and alone, and at the absolute end of his rope. Amara's world had always been governed by a simple, brutal code. You either fought to live, or you lay down to die. And this man was a fighter. The compassion in her, a deep, quiet well she rarely drew from, overwhelmed her fear. She made a decision. It was not a rational decision. It was a purely human one. She lowered the gaff. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent command. "You'll bleed out." He collapsed back against the wall, his eyes never leaving her face, a silent, desperate question in them. "Who are you?" She didn't have time for answers. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering on the pavement like dark coins. The storm was here. She looked at her heavy wooden cart, the one she used to haul ice in the morning, and her unsold fish in the evening. It was her only option. "Can you walk?" she asked. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was done. Acting on pure instinct, Amara moved with a speed that would have surprised anyone who knew her. She grabbed a pile of empty, foul-smelling fish crates and threw them into the alley. Then she took the heavy, oilskin tarpaulin she used to cover her stall and laid it out. With a strength born of years of hauling 100-pound bags of ice, she managed to get him onto the tarp, his groans of pain tearing at her heart. She wrapped him in it, a grim, makeshift shroud. She wrestled his heavy, limp body into the base of her cart, a task that left her gasping for breath, her muscles screaming. She covered him with the empty crates, arranging them to create a space for him to breathe, hoping it would look like nothing more than a fish seller taking her rubbish home. By the time she was done, the rain was coming down in a torrential, blinding sheet. Soaking wet, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and adrenaline, Amara grabbed the handle of the heavy cart and began to pull, heading away from the lights of the market and toward the dark, quiet street where her small shack, her sanctuary, awaited. She was pulling a wounded, dangerous secret through the heart of a storm, with no idea that the man hidden beneath her empty crates would either be the end of her life or the beginning of it. The journey from the market to her shack was a brutal, anonymous battle fought in the heart of the storm. The rain came down in a solid, blinding curtain, turning the dusty streets of Port Caille into slick, muddy rivers. It was a blessing. The deluge provided cover, driving even the most resilient town gossips indoors and erasing her tracks the moment she made them. But it was also a curse. The heavy wooden wheels of her cart, designed for dry ground, sank into the muck, and every foot of progress was a new war. The weight of the cart was a living thing, a dead weight of secrets and consequences that seemed to grow heavier with each step. Her shoulders burned, her lungs ached, and the rain, cold and relentless, plastered her thin cotton dress to her skin. But she did not stop. She leaned into the handle, her calloused hands gripping the worn wood, and pulled. This was what she knew how to do. She knew how to fight the tide, how to work until her body screamed, how to push through the pain toward the promise of a quiet sanctuary. Her street was a row of small, identical shotgun shacks, all of them dark against the storm, their occupants huddled inside. No one saw her. She was just another shadow in a world washed clean of light. Getting the cart up the 3 rickety wooden steps to her small porch was the final, agonizing assault. She had to take it backward, one step at a time, her muscles straining to the point of tearing as she wrestled the impossible weight up and over each ledge. She fumbled with the key, her fingers numb and clumsy, and finally, the door swung open into the warm, dry darkness of her home. The shack was tiny, but it was hers. It was a testament to making the most of very little. The main room served as her kitchen, dining room, and living space. It was impeccably clean. The worn floorboards were swept. A small bouquet of wildflowers sat in a jam jar on the small table, and a quilt her grandmother had made was folded neatly over the back of the only comfortable chair. The air smelled of salt, old wood, and the faint, clean scent of the soap she made herself. It was the smell of home, of safety, and into this sanctuary she had just dragged the heart of the storm. Wrestling his unconscious form out of the cart and onto the floor was a grim, desperate struggle. He was a heavy man, solid with a soldier's muscle, and getting him out from under the crates without causing him more injury was nearly impossible. Finally, he was there, a broken giant lying on a pile of old blankets she had thrown down. The oilskin tarp was soaked in a horrifying mixture of rainwater and fresh blood. In the dim, yellow light of the single lamp she lit, she got her first real look at him and the extent of his injuries. The tattered fatigues were soaked through, clinging to a wound on his left side, just above his hip. It was a ragged, angry hole, the kind a bullet makes. Another wound, just as vicious, was torn through the thick muscle of his thigh. She was no doctor, but she could see the bullet had passed through both places. It was a miracle he was still alive. His breathing was shallow, his dark skin slick with a feverish sweat that had nothing to do with the rain. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to paralyze her. What had she done? She had a half-dead man, a man someone had shot, lying on her floor. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to run, to go to the sheriff now and tell him everything. But she knew how that story would end. The questions, the suspicion. Why had she hidden him? What was her relationship to him? In a town like Port Caille, a poor black woman bringing a wounded, fugitive black soldier into her home was a story that would write its own ugly ending. They would see her not as a good Samaritan, but as an accomplice. She was trapped. Her one act of impulsive compassion had backed her into a corner from which there was no easy escape. She looked down at his face. In the stillness of unconsciousness, the harsh lines of pain had softened. He looked younger than she had first thought. There was a vulnerability there that hadn't been visible in the alley. He was just a man, and if she did nothing, he would die on her floor. That was a truth she could not live with. Amara's fear hardened into a grim resolve. She was a fisherman's daughter. She knew how to deal with blood and guts. She knew how to clean what was dirty. A man's flesh was not so different from a fish's, she told herself, the thought a small, morbid piece of gallows humor that steadied her nerves. She went to work. Her movements became once again precise and efficient. She lit her stove to boil water. She tore up one of her few good linen sheets for bandages. From a small wooden chest, she took out the tools of her own rough medicine, a bottle of cheap, potent whiskey, a spool of thick fishing line, and a long, curved needle her father had used for mending nets. She found a pair of scissors and carefully, gently, cut away the blood-soaked fabric from his wounds. The sight of the raw, torn flesh made her stomach churn, but she pushed the feeling down. She poured the whiskey onto a clean rag, the sharp alcoholic scent filling the small room, and began to clean the wounds. He moaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, and his body arched in a violent spasm. "I know," she whispered, her voice a strange, fierce lullaby. "I know, just hold on. You just have to hold on." Through a haze of pain that was a red, roaring sea in his mind, he became aware of sensations. The fire in his side and leg, of course, that was a constant. But there were other things, a voice low and steady, a touch that was not gentle but firm, purposeful, and strangely comforting. He forced his eyes open, the small lamplit room swimming in and out of focus. He saw a woman. She was leaning over him, her face etched with a concentration so profound it was almost beautiful. He saw her hands. They were not soft, delicate hands. They were strong, capable, competent hands, stained and scarred by work. He saw the needle in her hand, the fishing line, and a primal soldier's understanding dawned. She was stitching him up. In his world, a world of betrayal and brutal self-interest, help was never given freely. It was always a transaction, usually paid for in blood or information. He had been running for 3 days, hunted, wounded, betrayed by his own. He expected a bullet, a knife, a call to the authorities. He did not expect this. This quiet, determined woman with the strong hands and the fierce, compassionate eyes, working under a single dim lamp in a small, clean room, while a storm raged outside. She was an anomaly. She was a miracle more unbelievable than surviving the ambush that had left him like this. Before the darkness reclaimed him, his last conscious thought was that he had never, in his entire life, seen anything so brave. Amara worked for over an hour, her body slick with sweat, her hands trembling from the strain. She stitched the worst of the torn flesh together with clumsy, functional sutures. Her father's lessons on mending a ripped net serving her in this strange, gruesome new context. She packed the wounds with clean rags soaked in the last of the whiskey and bound them tightly with the strips of linen. He had lost a terrifying amount of blood. His skin was now dangerously hot to the touch, the fever taking a firm hold. The immediate crisis of him bleeding to death was over, but a new, more insidious battle against infection and shock was just beginning. She finally sat back on her heels, the full weight of her exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. The small, orderly sanctuary of her home was now a field hospital. The air was thick with the smell of blood, whiskey, and wet earth. A dangerous stranger, a fugitive, lay unconscious on her floor, his life now completely terrifyingly in her hands. The storm outside was loud, the wind howling and the rain beating a relentless tattoo on her tin roof. But it was nothing compared to the quiet storm she had just unleashed within the four walls of her own life. The storm outside raged for 2 days, mirroring the fever that raged within the wounded soldier. For 48 hours, Amara's shack became a hermetically sealed world, a crucible where life and death were locked in a quiet, desperate struggle. Time lost its normal rhythm, marked not by the sun and the moon, which were hidden behind a bruised, weeping sky, but by the soldier's ragged breaths, the changing of his blood-soaked bandages, and the slow, agonizing drip of water from a small leak in her roof into a tin pot on the floor. Her life, once a predictable and orderly routine, was now a chaotic improvisation, a constant nerve-wracking response to the needs of the dying man on her floor. She did not leave the house. Her fish stall, the source of her meager livelihood, was abandoned, its shutters closed against the world. She told herself it was because of the storm, a convenient and plausible excuse. But the truth was, she had become a jailer, a nurse, and a guardian, and her prisoner was the secret that could destroy her. She fought the fever with the only weapon she had, the folk remedies and hard-won knowledge passed down from her grandmother. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, a natural source of the same compound found in aspirin, and forced the tepid liquid between his cracked, dry lips. He was mostly unconscious, lost in a delirium that sent him thrashing against the blankets, his hands clenching and unclenching on invisible weapons, his voice a low, guttural murmur of names and places that meant nothing to her. Sandpiper, Kilo 6, Rendezvous Point, Compromised. They were words from another world, a world of violence and betrayal. At times his eyes would fly open, wide and unfocused, staring at some unseen horror on the ceiling of her small shack. In those moments, he was not in her home. He was back in the hell that had sent him here. During these episodes, she would speak to him, her voice low and steady, the same tone she used to calm a spooked animal. "You're safe now," she would say, over and over, a mantra against the ghosts that haunted him. "The storm is loud, but you're safe in here. You're safe with me." She didn't know if he could hear her, if the words penetrated the fog of his pain, but she said them anyway, for him and for herself. She cleaned his wounds twice a day, a gruesome, stomach-churning ritual that she approached with a grim, methodical focus. Each time she unwrapped the crude bandages, she feared the telltale signs of creeping infection, the angry red streaks, the foul smell of decay. She washed the torn flesh with boiled, salted water and applied a poultice of crushed yarrow leaves, another of her grandmother's remedies for stopping bleeding and fighting putrefaction. His body was a landscape of old and new violence. Beneath the fresh, angry wounds, his dark skin was a map of scars, the thin, silvery lines of old cuts, the puckered, circular divots of healed bullet wounds, the ragged burn scar that covered a portion of his shoulder. This was not a man who was a stranger to pain. This was a man whose entire life, it seemed, had been a war, and in the midst of this brutal geography of his past, her clumsy stitches, sewn with fishing line, were a strange domestic touch, a humble attempt to mend a man who seemed to be made of nothing but battle scars. On the third morning, the storm broke. The rain stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy window of her shack, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the chaos within. The fever broke with it. Amara was dozing in her chair, a bone-deep exhaustion her only companion, when a sound jerked her awake. It was a voice, no longer the delirious mumble of a dying man, but a hoarse, weak but clear sound. "Water!" She was on her feet in an instant. His eyes were open, and for the first time, they were focused. They were lucid. They were fixed on her. The color was a deep, dark brown, and they held an intelligence and an intensity that was startling. She brought him a cup of cool water from the rain barrel, her hands trembling slightly. She had to lift his head, her arm under his neck to help him drink. The simple physical act of contact was incredibly intimate. She could feel the wiry strength in his neck, the heat still radiating from his skin. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin and onto his chest. He finished the cup and sank back onto the blankets, his eyes closing for a moment, gathering his strength. "Thank you," he said, the words a rough rasp in his throat. His eyes opened again and scanned the small room, taking in the details with a soldier's quick, assessing gaze. The single door, the two windows, the pot catching the drip from the ceiling, the discarded, blood-stained rags in a bucket in the corner. His gaze finally settled back on her. "Who are you?" he asked. "Amara," she said simply. "My name is Amara." "Amara," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. I'm Damon." He tried to push himself up, a reflexive action of a man not used to being helpless, but a sharp, agonizing intake of breath and a spasm of pain in his side forced him back down. "Don't," she commanded, her voice firm. "You've been stitched together with fishing line. You move like that again, you'll tear yourself open." A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face. "Fishing line, it's what I had," she said, a faint defensive note in her voice. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the deep purple smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, the strain in the set of her jaw. He saw the strength in her hands, now resting on her lap. He saw the quiet, unshakable dignity in her posture. "You saved my life," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a sense of quiet wonder. "You were bleeding out in my alley," she replied, deflecting the weight of his words with a simple, practical truth. "I couldn't just leave you there." A fragile, tentative truce settled over the room. For the next few days, a new routine was established. He was still weak, confined to his pallet on the floor, but his strength was returning with a speed that amazed her. His soldier's body, honed by years of brutal training, was fighting its own war of recovery, and it was winning. He was a quiet patient, demanding nothing, his discipline ingrained even in his helplessness. He would watch her as she moved about the small shack, her daily routines of cooking, cleaning, and mending a source of silent fascination for him. He watched the way her hands, so strong and capable when she had tended his wounds, moved with a surprising grace as she kneaded dough for bread. He watched the way the sunlight from the window caught the stray curls that had escaped from her long, thick braid. He listened to the sound of her voice, a low, melodic hum, as she sometimes sang softly to herself while she worked. He was a man who had spent his life in a world of harsh, masculine noise. The bark of a drill sergeant, the crack of gunfire, the roar of a helicopter. The quiet domestic symphony of Amara's life was a kind of music he had never heard before, and it was beginning to heal parts of him he hadn't even known were broken. He learned her story in small, fragmented pieces, not because she offered it, but because he observed it. He saw the worn-out photo on her mantelpiece of a proud, stern-faced man who looked like her, standing on a fishing boat, her father. He saw the single, small shelf of books, the spines cracked and worn from countless readings. He saw the fierce pride she took in her small, impoverished home, and he began to fall in love. It was not a sudden, dramatic passion. It was a slow, quiet, and inexorable process, like the turning of the tide. He fell in love with her strength, a resilience that was so profound it was almost elemental. He fell in love with her compassion, an unsentimental, practical kindness that had compelled her to risk everything for a dangerous stranger. He fell in love with the quiet sanctuary she had built for herself in a harsh and unforgiving world. He was a man on the run, a ghost with a past that was hunting him, and he knew he had no right to feel these things. He knew he was a danger to her, but lying on her floor, watching this poor, proud, beautiful fish seller go about her day, Damon knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that he had been saved in more ways than one. The fragile peace of their convalescent world could not last. Amara knew this. Every day that Damon grew stronger, the danger he represented grew larger, more immediate. He was a secret she couldn't keep hidden in her tiny shack forever. The town of Port Caille was a small, interconnected ecosystem of gossip and suspicion, and her absence from the market had not gone unnoticed. On the fourth day after the storm, there was a knock at her door. It was a sharp, peremptory sound that sent a jolt of pure ice through Amara's veins. Damon, who had been sitting up, propped against the wall, was instantly transformed. The quiet, watchful patient vanished, replaced by the soldier. His body went rigid, his eyes becoming hard, flat, and lethally focused. He instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there. Amara put a finger to her lips, a silent command for him to stay down, to make no sound. She moved to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the small, grimy pane of glass, she saw the unmistakable bulk of Sheriff Brody's patrol car. Sheriff Brody was a man who embodied the town's worst qualities, a lazy, self-important bully who wore his badge as a license for petty tyranny. He was a man who feasted on the troubles of others, and his presence on her doorstep could mean only one thing: trouble had found her. She took a deep, steadying breath and opened the door a crack, her body blocking the view of the room behind her. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a model of calm, respectful neutrality. "What can I do for you?" Brody, a large, florid man whose uniform was stretched taut over his considerable belly, peered at her with small, suspicious eyes. "Amara, haven't seen you at the market the last few days. Figured I'd check in, make sure everything's all right." His concern was a lie, a thin veil over his intrusive curiosity. He was sniffing for gossip, for a crack in the quiet, orderly facade of her life. "The storm," she said simply. "Took a couple days to fix a leak in the roof. I'll be back tomorrow." It was a plausible, boring explanation, designed to quell his interest, but Brody's gaze drifted past her, trying to pierce the shadows of the room. "Smells different in here," he said, his nostrils flaring, like antiseptic. Amara's blood ran cold. The whiskey, the boiled rags, the scent of healing clung to the small space. "Cleaning solution," she said, her mind racing to invent a plausible lie. "The damp from the storm, trying to keep the mildew at bay." Brody didn't look convinced. His eyes narrowed. "Heard a funny thing the other day," he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "Just before the storm hit, some of the boys down at the docks thought they heard shouting, maybe a gunshot, down by the ice house." He was fishing, casting a wide net, hoping to snag a piece of information. Amara kept her face a perfect, placid mask. She would give him nothing. "The wind plays tricks with the sound down there, Sheriff. You know that. she said, her tone unwavering. Probably just a tourist's car backfiring. Brody held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. A silent battle of wills fought on her doorstep. He was looking for a flicker of fear, a sign of deception. Amara met his gaze with the same calm, steady look she gave a difficult customer. She had nothing to hide. Her face was a fortress. Finally, with a grunt of dissatisfaction, he seemed to give up. "Well, you stay out of trouble, you hear?" he said, the words a casual warning. "Wouldn't want to see a good woman like you get mixed up in anything unpleasant." He turned and ambled back to his car, his authority asserted, his curiosity momentarily sated. Amara watched until his car had disappeared around the corner before she closed the door, her knees suddenly weak with relief. She leaned against the cool wood, her eyes closed, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She turned to find Damon watching her, his expression a mixture of profound admiration and grim resolve. "He knows," Damon said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He doesn't know what he knows, but he smells a secret. He'll be back, and he'll bring others." The sanctuary was compromised. The walls of her small shack, which had felt so strong and safe, were now as fragile as glass. He began to struggle to his feet, ignoring the searing pain that the movement undoubtedly caused. "I have to go," he said, his jaw tight with effort. "I've brought enough trouble to your door. I won't bring any more." "Go where?" she demanded, her fear replaced by a sudden, fierce anger. "You can barely stand. You'll be dead or in a jail cell before you get to the edge of town." "That's my problem, not yours," he said, his voice harsh with a self-loathing she didn't understand. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has, Amara. I won't repay you by letting you get caught in the crossfire." He was pushing her away, trying to protect her by cutting her out, just as he had likely done his entire life. He was a soldier trained to operate alone, to be a self-contained unit. He didn't know how to accept help. He didn't know how to be a part of a team that wasn't a military one. "You think this is just about you?" she shot back, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them both. "You think you can just walk in here, bleed all over my floor, let me stitch you back together, and then just walk out again? My life is already tangled up in yours, you fool. That sheriff, he looks at me now, and he sees a secret. Whether you are here or not, that suspicion will follow me. My trouble, as you call it, has already begun. So you can either lie back down and let yourself heal so we can figure this out together, or you can stumble out that door and get yourself killed and leave me here to face the consequences alone." Her words, a torrent of frustrated, terrified truth, hung in the air between them. He stared at her, stunned into silence by her ferocity. No one had ever spoken to him like that. He was used to commands or deference. He was not used to this raw, passionate, and utterly undeniable logic. She was right. His trouble was now her trouble. By saving him, she had inadvertently bound her fate to his. He saw the fire in her eyes, the proud, stubborn set of her jaw. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a fighter. She was a soldier in her own right. Defeated by her logic and his own weakness, he sank back down onto the blankets, his respect for her deepening into something akin to awe. "All right, Amara," he said, his voice soft, a surrender and a promise. "Together." The words sealed their alliance. They were a unit now, a team of two against a world of threats. The dynamic in the shack shifted. He was no longer just her patient. He was her partner. He began to talk, not about the specifics of who was hunting him, which he still kept veiled in a soldier's secrecy, but about the principles of survival. He began to train her. He taught her how to be invisible, how to move without being seen, how to use the shadows and the noise of the town as camouflage. He showed her how to read people like Sheriff Brody, how to spot the subtle tells in their posture and their speech that betrayed their intentions. He turned her small, familiar world into a tactical map. "That alleyway behind the baker's shop," he'd say, looking out her back window. "It's a perfect escape route. It lets out onto the canal. Always know your exits." He taught her how to think like a soldier, how to see the world not as a safe, predictable place, but as a constantly shifting landscape of threats and opportunities. And as she learned, Amara found a part of herself she never knew existed, a sharp, strategic mind that had been lying dormant beneath the numbingly repetitive routine of her life. She was a natural. Her years of observing the subtle shifts in the weather and the habits of the fishermen had already given her the instincts. He was just giving her the language for them. And as he taught her, as they planned and strategized in the dim light of her shack, the intimacy between them grew, transforming from the quiet care of a nurse and patient into the deep, unspoken trust of two soldiers sharing a foxhole. The danger outside was immense, but inside the four walls of her home, something powerful and beautiful was beginning to bloom in the heart of the storm. The day after Sheriff Brody's visit, Amara returned to the market. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay in the shack, to guard her secret, to protect Damon. But Damon himself had insisted it was the only way. The most dangerous thing you can be right now is a mystery, he had told her, his voice a low, urgent murmur as he coached her before she left. You have to be exactly who you've always been. Boring, predictable, part of the landscape. Go back to your routine, answer their questions before they even ask them. Complain about the leak in your roof, talk about the price of shrimp. Be Amara, the fish seller, hide in plain sight. It was a soldier's advice, a lesson in camouflage, and she knew he was right. So she walked back into her world, feeling like a spy behind enemy lines. The stall, which had been her kingdom, now felt like an exposed position on a battlefield. Every casual greeting from another vendor, every question from a customer felt like an interrogation. "Hey, Amara, thought that storm had washed you away," called out old Mr. Guidry from the produce stall next to hers. "Just about," she called back, forcing a weary smile as she began to arrange her fresh catch on a bed of ice. Had a roof leak the size of a dinner plate, spent 2 days chasing it with a bucket. And it was the story she had rehearsed with Damon, a simple, believable lie that accounted for her absence and the fatigue that was etched onto her face. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but she repeated it a dozen times that day, embellishing it with details about the cost of tar and the uselessness of her landlord, until it began to feel almost real. She moved through the day on autopilot, her hands performing the familiar, comforting tasks of her trade, weighing fish, making change, sharpening her filleting knife, while her mind was a whirlwind of anxiety. She felt the weight of hidden eyes on her. Was that customer lingering a little too long? Was that fisherman asking too many questions about her time off? Paranoia was a new, unwelcome companion. Sheriff Brody made a point of strolling through the market in the late afternoon. He didn't come to her stall directly. He just loitered. He bought a bag of peaches from Mr. Guidry, his back to her, but she could feel his presence, a heavy, oppressive weight. He was watching her, she was sure of it, observing her, waiting for a crack in her performance. She kept her head down, focusing on gutting a large grouper, her movements deft and sure, her face a mask of practiced concentration. It was the hardest performance of her life. When he finally moved on, the release of tension was so profound, she felt dizzy. Hiding in plain sight was more exhausting than any physical labor she had ever known. She had survived the day, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Brody was a dog with a bone. He would not let it go. When she returned to the shack that evening, the smell of food and the profound relief of safety washed over her. Damon was on his feet, moving slowly but steadily around the small room. He had found a discarded piece of driftwood on her porch and fashioned it into a crude but effective crutch. He had also cleaned the entire shack, tidied her scattered belongings, and prepared a simple meal of rice and beans. He had transformed her sanctuary from a chaotic field hospital back into a home. Seeing him standing there, a quiet, domestic presence in the heart of her home, stirred something deep inside her. For her entire adult life, she had been alone. She had cooked for one, cleaned for one, faced every struggle on her own. The simple, profound act of another person caring for her, of sharing the burden of her life, was a feeling so foreign and so powerful it almost brought her to tears. "How was it?" he asked, his eyes searching her face, reading the exhaustion and the strain there. "It was hard," she admitted, sinking into her chair. "I felt like everyone was staring at me, like they could see right through me." "You did well," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "You did what most trained operatives can't do. You held your cover under pressure. You should be proud." His praise, so simple and sincere, was a balm to her frayed nerves. They ate in a comfortable silence, the small table feeling less like a piece of furniture and more like an island of peace. peace in a sea of trouble. After they had eaten, he began the now familiar ritual of tending to his own wounds, his movements slow and careful. She watched him, a silent observer. "Who did this to you, Damon?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She had respected his silence, his need for secrecy, but now she needed to know. She needed to understand the nature of the enemy they were fighting together. He paused, his hands stilling on the clean bandage he was about to apply. He looked at her, his expression grim. "The men I used to call brothers," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "My unit." He told her the story, not all of it, but enough. He was part of an elite, clandestine special forces team, a unit that officially didn't exist. They were ghosts, used for the government's dirtiest, most deniable operations. Their last mission had gone wrong. They had been sent to intercept a shipment of illegal weapons, but when they got there, they found something else entirely, a massive consignment of uncut diamonds, a black market fortune being smuggled into the country by a corrupt politician their own superiors were protecting. They had been set up. The mission was a trap, designed to eliminate them and the incriminating knowledge they now possessed. His own commander, a man he had trusted with his life, had led them into an ambush. Damon was the only one who had escaped, wounded, with a data drive containing the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. "So, they're not just hunting you," Amara said, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. "They're hunting what you're carrying." He nodded, tapping a small, almost invisible bulge under the bandage on his thigh. The data drive. It was the reason for the second bullet wound. They hadn't just been trying to kill him, they had been trying to recover the evidence. "And they won't stop until they get it," he finished, "or until I'm dead." The scale of the danger was suddenly terrifyingly clear. This was not a local problem. This was not about Sheriff Brody's suspicions. This was a war against a shadowy, powerful enemy who operated outside the law, who had the resources of the government at their disposal, and who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. That included her. She had not just saved a wounded soldier. She had given sanctuary to the single most wanted man in a very dangerous secret world. She should have been terrified. A part of her was, but another, stronger part of her was filled with a cold, righteous anger. The injustice of it, the betrayal. It resonated with her own quiet, lifelong struggle against a system that was designed to keep people like her down. The enemy was bigger, but the fight was the same. It was the powerful against the powerless. It was the corrupt against the honorable. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice not trembling with fear, but steady with a newfound resolve. "How do we fight them?" A slow, dangerous smile touched Damon's lips. He was seeing in her the same unbreakable spirit he had recognized in the alleyway. "We don't fight them on their terms," he said. "We can't win a battle of guns and resources, so we fight a battle of information. That drive is our only weapon. I have one contact I can trust, a journalist in New Orleans. If I can get this evidence to him, he can blow the whole thing wide open. He can bring the truth into the light. Light is the one thing these people can't survive." "New Orleans," Amara said, the name of the city hanging in the air. It was 100 miles away, 100 miles of open road, of police patrols, of potential ambushes. It was an impossible journey. "How?" she asked. Damon's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a set of keys hung on a nail. The keys to the beat-up, unreliable but anonymous old pickup truck her father had left her. "We need a vehicle," he said. "Something that won't be noticed. Something that can disappear on a back road." He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. He was not commanding her. He was asking her to join the mission, to risk not just her home, but her life, to become a willing accomplice in his desperate, righteous war. She thought of her life, of the endless, grinding routine of the fish stall. She thought of the quiet, lonely nights in her shack. This man, this dangerous, honorable soldier, had brought chaos and fear into her world. But he had also brought something else, a sense of purpose, a reason to fight for something more than just her own survival. She stood up, walked to the wall, and took the keys off the nail. She came back to the table and placed them in his hand. "When do we leave?" she asked. The decision, once made, settled over the small shack with a grave and silent finality. They were no longer just hiding, they were preparing for an offensive. The air crackled with the quiet, focused energy of two soldiers planning a desperate incursion into enemy territory. Damon, now their designated commander, began to lay out the strategy with a calm, methodical precision that belied the immense danger of their undertaking. His weakness was still a significant handicap, his movements slow and pained, but his mind was a sharp, tactical weapon. He turned Amara's home into a staging ground, a familiar domestic world repurposed for a war she had never imagined. "The truck is our biggest vulnerability," he began, his voice a low, serious murmur as they sat at her small kitchen table, a hand-drawn map of the Louisiana backroads spread between them. "It's registered to you. Brody finds us gone and the truck missing. That's the first thing he'll put out an alert on. We'll have every state trooper between here and New Orleans looking for a beat-up Ford with your plates." "So, we can't take it?" Amara asked, a knot of disappointment tightening in her stomach. It was their only real asset. "We take it," Damon corrected, a faint, determined glint in his eyes. "But we change its identity. We make it a ghost." For the next 2 days, under the cover of darkness, they worked. Damon, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch, directed her with quiet, clear instructions. He was the strategist. She was his hands, his legs, his strength. They became a seamless, efficient unit. On the first night, he had her drive the old truck to a secluded spot deep in the bayou, a place where fishermen sometimes abandoned old boats. There, using a set of tools from her father's old toolbox, she learned how to remove a license plate and replace it with a stolen one Damon had her acquire from a derelict car in a junkyard. The simple act of theft, so alien to her nature, sent a thrill of fear and rebellion through her. She was breaking the law, but she was doing it to uphold a higher one, the law of survival, of justice. Next, he taught her how to change the truck's appearance. They used a mixture of mud and clay from the bayou's edge to paint over the truck's distinctive faded blue color, transforming it into a nondescript, muddy brown, the color of the earth itself. "It's not about making it look new," he explained, as she slapped the thick, wet mud onto the rusted fenders. "It's about making it look forgettable. People don't notice things that are dirty, that blend in. It's the best camouflage there is." The irony was not lost on her. Her entire life, she had been made to feel invisible by a world that valued wealth and status. Now, that same invisibility was their most powerful weapon. On the second night, they prepared their supplies. They siphoned gasoline from an abandoned tractor into several large canisters. They packed what was left of her non-perishable food, rice, dried beans, canned goods, and filled every available container with fresh water. Damon showed her how to pack a go bag, a small, efficient bundle of essentials, a first aid kit, a knife, a compass, a waterproof tarp. It was a soldier's survival kit, and the grim reality of what it represented, the possibility of having to abandon the truck and flee into the wilderness on foot, was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. During these long, intense nights of preparation, a new, deeper intimacy bloomed between them. Working together in the close, humid darkness, their bodies often brushing against each other, their hands sometimes touching as they passed a tool or a container, a powerful, unspoken current of attraction began to flow. It was a connection forged not in candlelight and soft words, but in the shared, visceral reality of their struggle. Amara found herself watching him, mesmerized by the quiet competence of his movements, the intelligence in his eyes, the way his focus never wavered. He, in turn, found himself captivated by her. He saw the fierce determination in the set of her jaw as she struggled to loosen a rusted bolt, the surprising strength in her arms as she lifted a heavy can of gasoline. He saw not just a woman who had saved him, but a partner, an equal, a soldier as tough and resilient as any he had ever served with. If Amara's quiet transformation from a simple fish seller into a determined warrior for justice has touched your heart, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue honoring souls like hers. Her courage is a testament to the hidden strength within us all. On the final night before their planned departure, as they sat in the shack, making a final check of their supplies, the tension was a palpable thing. The time for preparation was over. The mission was about to begin. "Are you scared?" he asked her, his voice unusually soft. She looked at him, her gaze direct and honest. "Terrified," she admitted, "but I've been scared my whole life. Scared of not having enough money to fix the roof. Scared of getting sick. Scared of growing old alone in this shack. This is a different kind of scared. It feels bigger. It feels like it matters." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her calloused, work-roughened fingers intertwined with his scarred soldier's ones. His touch was not a gesture of romantic seduction. It was a gesture of profound, comradely solidarity. It was the touch of two people who were about to go into battle together. "You are the bravest person I have ever met, Amara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal. "Braver than any soldier. You fight every day, with no weapons, no backup, and no expectation of a medal. You just endure, and you do it with a goodness in your heart that this world doesn't deserve." She could see it in his eyes then, the thing that had been building between them, the unspoken truth that had been present since the moment he first woke up on her floor. It was a raw, vulnerable, and deeply honest emotion that went beyond gratitude, beyond partnership. It was love, a love born in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. He leaned in, his movements slow, hesitant, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision. It was desperate and deep, a raw, hungry expression of all the fear, the pain, and the hope that had been building between them. It was a kiss that tasted of salt, of sweat, of desperation, and of a profound, soul-deep recognition. In that moment, they were not a soldier and a fish seller. They were just a man and a woman, finding a moment of grace and beauty in the heart of a war. They left just before dawn, under the cover of the pre-dawn mist that rolled in off the Gulf. They slipped out of the shack, leaving it looking as quiet and undisturbed as possible, a silent, empty stage where a life-altering drama had just been played. The old truck, now a muddy, anonymous beast, started with a reluctant, sputtering cough that sounded deafeningly loud in the morning stillness. Amara was behind the wheel, her hands gripping it tightly, her knuckles white. Damon sat in the passenger seat, a shotgun they had found in her father's old shed, cleaned, oiled, and loaded, resting across his lap. His presence was a calm, reassuring weight beside her. As they rolled slowly, silently, down the sleeping streets of Port Caille, the only home she had ever known, she did not look back. Her past was behind her. Her future was an unknown, dangerous road stretching out ahead. She took a deep breath and pressed her foot on the accelerator, guiding the ghost truck onto the back road that led out of town. A single, determined woman who had found her own war and her own reason to fight it. They were two fugitives, two soldiers, two lovers, a team of two against a corrupt and powerful world, driving into the uncertain dawn. The world beyond Port Caille was a flat, monotonous landscape of sugarcane fields and swampland, stitched together by a network of cracked, two-lane asphalt roads that shimmered in the oppressive Louisiana heat. This was the terrain of their war, a world away from the urban battlefields Damon knew. For the first few hours, the journey was a nerve-wracking crawl. Amara drove with a focused, almost painful intensity, her eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, her body tensed for the sight of flashing lights, for the inevitable moment when their luck would run out. Damon sat beside her, a silent, watchful co-pilot. He was not relaxed, but a deep, focused calm had settled over him. He was back on a mission, and in that, there was a strange, familiar comfort. He navigated using a tattered, old-fashioned paper map, deliberately choosing the most obscure, forgotten back roads that were little more than dirt tracks connecting one small, dying town to the next. "The main highways are arteries," he explained, his finger tracing a faint, meandering line on the map. "They're easy to monitor, easy to block. These are the capillaries. They're slow, they're inefficient, but they're invisible. We stay in the capillaries." Their ghost truck, caked in mud and anonymity, blended in perfectly with the landscape of rural poverty. They passed rusted-out mobile homes, sagging porches where old men watched them pass with incurious eyes, and fields where laborers toiled under the brutal sun. In this world, a beat-up old Ford was not a cause for suspicion, it was the norm. They were hiding in the open, shielded by the very poverty and neglect that defined the region. The greatest danger was not the open road, but the small towns they were forced to pass through, islands of potential exposure in their sea of anonymity. In each town, they would feel the subtle shift in atmosphere. People noticed strangers here. A new truck, even a forgettable one, was a brief topic of conversation at the local diner or the gas station. During these passages, a tense, practiced silence would fall over them. Amara would keep her gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead, her face a neutral mask. Damon would sink a little lower in his seat, pulling his baseball cap down to shadow his face, his hand never straying far from the shotgun at his feet. They passed through towns with names like Grosse Tête, Plaquemine, and White Castle, each one a small gauntlet they had to run, a test of their nerve and their camouflage. By midday, the adrenaline that had fueled their escape began to fade, replaced by a deep, wearying exhaustion. Damon's wounds, though healing, were a constant nagging source of pain, and the jarring, bumpy ride was taking its toll. Amara could see the fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tight white lines of pain around his mouth. He never complained, but she could read the signs. She pulled the truck over on a deserted stretch of road, under the shade of a massive, moss-draped oak tree. "We need to rest," she said, her voice a quiet command, "and you need to change those bandages." Without waiting for an argument, she got out of the truck. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the sound of cicadas. In the back of the truck, under the tarp, she had a bucket of clean water and the remainder of her first aid supplies. She helped him out of the passenger seat, his movements stiff and slow. He leaned against the warm metal of the truck, his face pale, as she gently, skillfully cleaned and redressed the wound on his side. Her touch was no longer just the competent care of a nurse. It was the intimate, gentle ministration of a lover. "You're a stubborn man, Damon," she murmured, her fingers working deftly on the clean bandage. "You push yourself too hard." "It's the only way I know," he said, his voice a low, tired rasp. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion. "I'm not used to having someone care. Get used to it," she said, her voice soft but firm. They sat there for an hour in the relative safety of their anonymity, sharing a meal of stale crackers and canned beans. It was the most romantic meal of Amara's life. They spoke in low tones, their conversation a continuation of the intimacy that had been forged in the shack. She told him about her father, about his quiet strength and his stubborn pride, and the deep, abiding love of the sea he had passed on to her. He, in turn, told her about his childhood, about a mother who had worked 2 jobs and a neighborhood that had offered only 2 ways out, a jail cell or a recruiting station. He had chosen the army, not out of patriotism, but out of a desperate, pragmatic need for escape. He spoke of the brotherhood he had found there and the profound, soul-shattering pain of their betrayal. "They weren't just my unit," he said, his voice thick with a grief he had never allowed himself to express before. "They were my family, the only one I ever really had, and they tried to kill me." Amara listened, her heart aching for him, for the deep, lonely wound that lay beneath the physical ones. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She had no words of comfort to offer, no easy platitudes, so she just held his hand, offering him the silent, powerful solace of her presence. He was not alone in his foxhole anymore. They were 100 miles from Port Caille and a world away from the people they had been just a week ago. He was no longer just a soldier, and she was no longer just a fish seller. The crisis had stripped them down to their essential selves, revealing a core of shared strength, courage, and a fierce, stubborn will to survive. The love that had sparked between them was now a deep, steady flame, a source of warmth and light in the dark, dangerous world they inhabited. As they prepared to get back on the road, a new sound intruded on the quiet hum of the cicadas. It was the distant, unmistakable sound of a siren. It grew steadily louder, coming from the direction they had just traveled. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Amara. "They found us," she breathed, her eyes wide with fear. Damon was instantly alert, the weary patient replaced by the seasoned warrior. "Get in the truck," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent snap. "Get in and drive, do not stop, do not look back." He grabbed the shotgun, and ignoring the searing pain in his side, he half ran, half limped, to a deep, overgrown ditch on the side of the road, disappearing into the tall grass just as a state trooper's car, its lights flashing, roared past them. The car did not slow down. It sped past their position and continued down the road, the siren fading into the distance. It was not looking for them. It was heading to some other, unrelated emergency. They waited in the ringing silence for a full 5 minutes before Damon emerged from the ditch, his face grim. The false alarm had been a brutal reminder of just how precarious their situation was. They were living on a knife's edge, and the slightest misstep, the smallest piece of bad luck, could be fatal. "We can't risk the roads anymore," he said, his voice tight. "Not even these. We're too exposed. We have to ditch the truck and go on foot from here." He looked at the map, his finger tracing a path through a vast, green, and completely roadless area. The Atchafalaya Basin, the largest wetland and swamp in the United States. "It's another 20 miles from here to the rendezvous point on the other side of the basin," he said. "It's our only option. It's the one place they won't be able to follow us with a vehicle." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, deeper worry. He had pushed her to her limit, and now he was asking her to go further, to step off the edge of the known world and into one of the most wild and unforgiving landscapes in North America. "Amara," he began. "You don't have to—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Don't you dare tell me I don't have to do this. We are a unit, remember? Your mission is my mission. We're in this together until the end." He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes, and a profound, overwhelming sense of love and gratitude washed over him. He had been a ghost, a man running from a world of betrayal, and in the heart of Louisiana, in the company of a poor, brave fish seller, he had found his home. He had found his reason to fight. "All right, soldier," he said, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "Let's go." Abandoning the truck felt like setting their last bridge on fire. It was their shelter, their transportation, their one tangible link to a world of familiar mechanics and predictable physics. Now, their world was shrinking to the contents of 2 small backpacks and the few feet of solid ground directly beneath their boots. Damon found a dense, overgrown logging trail that branched off the main road, and Amara drove the old Ford a quarter-mile down the track, nosing it into a thicket of palmetto bushes where it was almost completely swallowed by the voracious green of the swamp. She turned off the engine for the last time, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the distant caw of a crow. She looked at the dashboard, at the faded photograph of her father she had always kept tucked into the sun visor. She took it, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the image, and slipped it into her pocket. It was the only piece of her old life she would carry into the new one. They shouldered their packs, Damon leaning heavily on a sturdy branch he had fashioned into a walking stick, and stepped off the trail, plunging into the untamed wilderness of the Atchafalaya Basin. The swamp was a different beast from the coastal marshlands she knew. This was a primeval world, a vast, watery forest of towering cypress and tupelo trees that formed a dense cathedral-like canopy high above their heads, filtering the harsh afternoon sun into a dim, greenish twilight. The air was thick, heavy, and wet, smelling of mud, decaying vegetation, and the sweet, cloying scent of wild jasmine. The ground was a treacherous, uneven carpet of roots, mud, and pools of stagnant black water. Every step was a struggle. For Amara, whose body was already aching with the fatigue that had settled deep into her bones, it was a brutal, punishing ordeal. The humidity was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, and within minutes her clothes were soaked with sweat. Mosquitoes, thick and ferocious, descended upon them in whining, persistent clouds. But it was Damon who was in the most immediate visible distress. The long, jarring truck ride had taken a severe toll on his still-healing wounds. Every step he took was a visible effort of will over pain. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and a fine sheen of cold sweat covered his skin. He was pushing his body far beyond its limits, and Amara could see the soldier's iron discipline beginning to fray at the edges. They moved in silence for the first hour, conserving their energy, their only communication the occasional hand signal from Damon, directing her around a particularly treacherous patch of mud or a coiled cottonmouth snake she hadn't seen. But as the afternoon wore on, his pace began to slow. He started to stumble, his bad leg dragging, his breathing growing more ragged. Amara watched him with a growing, gnawing sense of fear. He was their guide, their commander. His strength, his knowledge, was the only thing keeping them alive. If he went down, they were both lost. She could not let that happen. She fell back, walking beside him, her presence a quiet offer of support. "Let me take some of the weight," she said, reaching for his backpack, which was heavier than hers, containing most of their water and the small, heavy satellite phone. "I'm fine," he grunted, the words a familiar, stubborn mantra of masculine pride. "No, you're not," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You're hurt, Damon, and if you go down, we both go down. We are a unit. That means we share the burden, all of it." He stopped, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his chest heaving. He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering resolve in her eyes. He saw not pity, but strength. He saw not a woman trying to coddle him, but a soldier demanding that her commanding officer stop being a fool. For a man who had spent his entire life being the strong one, the protector, the one who endured, the act of accepting help, of admitting weakness, was harder than any physical pain. But he looked at her, and he knew she was right. With a slow, reluctant sigh, he shrugged off the heavy pack. The relief was immediate and visible. Amara swung the pack onto her own shoulders, the added weight settling onto her frame. It was heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of shared responsibility, of partnership. She was no longer just the person being saved. She was an active, essential part of their survival. The dynamic between them shifted in that moment. She was not just his follower. She was his equal, his support, his strength. They pressed on, their progress agonizingly slow. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the swamp transformed. The familiar shapes of trees and vines dissolved into a menacing, formless darkness. The sounds changed, the daytime chorus of insects and birds replaced by the deeper, more threatening calls of nocturnal predators, the hoot of an owl, the splash of a large animal in the water nearby, the deep, guttural bellow of an alligator that sounded terrifyingly close. Fear, cold and primal, began to creep into the edges of Amara's resolve. This was a world that was utterly indifferent to their survival. They were small, soft, and vulnerable, and the darkness was full of things with teeth and claws. Damon, however, seemed to draw strength from the darkness. It was his element. He produced 2 small, powerful flashlights from his pack, their beams cutting sharp, white tunnels through the oppressive black. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "And listen to me. Don't listen to the swamp. It will try to scare you. It will play tricks on your mind." They found a small, relatively dry patch of ground at the base of a massive, ancient cypress tree, whose gnarled roots formed a natural, protective wall. This would be their camp for the night. They ate a cold, meager meal of dried fruit and nuts, their bodies screaming for rest. Damon took the first watch. Amara, wrapped in the thin, waterproof tarp, tried to sleep, but the sounds of the swamp, amplified by the darkness and her own exhaustion, kept her on a razor's edge of alertness. She must have dozed off because she was startled awake by a hand on her shoulder. It was Damon. "My watch is over," he whispered. "Your turn." He was in obvious, severe pain. He had pushed his body too far. He collapsed onto the ground beside her, his breathing shallow and rapid. She could feel the heat of his fever even through his clothes. The infection was coming back, stronger this time, fueled by exhaustion and the filthy swamp water. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in her throat. She had no more willow bark, no more yarrow. She had nothing. She reached into her pack and pulled out the small first aid kit. There was a bottle of antiseptic and a few precious individually wrapped antibiotic pills that Damon had insisted they pack. He had 5 of them, a last desperate line of defense. Without a word, she opened a bottle of water and handed him 2 of the pills. He swallowed them, his eyes, even in the darkness, filled with a silent gratitude. She gently cleaned his wounds again, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle touch in the dim glow of the flashlight. "You need to rest," she said, her voice a fierce, protective whisper. "A real rest. I'll take the watch for the rest of the night." "Amara, you can't," he started to protest. "I can," she said, cutting him off. "I will. Now sleep, soldier." She sat with her back against the ancient tree, the shotgun across her lap, a lone sentry in the heart of a vast, menacing wilderness. She was the guardian now. She was the protector. She listened to Damon's breathing, shallow and fevered, and she made a silent, solemn vow. She had pulled this man from an alley, had stitched him together with fishing line, had followed him into this hell. She would not let him die here. She would get him through this night. She would carry him the rest of the way if she had to. She would get him to New Orleans. She would get him to the truth. She was no longer Amara, the poor fish seller from Port Caille. She was a warrior, and this was her war. The night was a long, dark vigil, a trial by fear and exhaustion. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth sent a jolt of adrenaline through Amara, her hand tightening on the cold, reassuring weight of the shotgun. The swamp, which had been a place of awe and terror, now became a living entity she had to understand, to anticipate. She learned to distinguish the harmless sounds, the scuttling of an armadillo, the splash of a leaping mullet, from the ones that raised the hair on her arms, the low, throaty growl that could be a wild hog, the heavy, deliberate tread of something large moving just beyond the circle of her flashlight's beam. She was no longer a visitor in this world. She was a part of it, a creature of the night, as alert and watchful as any predator. She was fueled by a fierce primal instinct to protect the man who lay sleeping fitfully beside her. His life was in her hands, and that responsibility was a heavy weight that paradoxically gave her a strength she had never known she possessed. She was no longer afraid for herself. Her fear was for him, and that made her brave. As the first faint, pearly grey light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy, she saw that the fever had broken. Damon was sleeping a deep, natural sleep, his breathing even, his skin cool to the touch. The antibiotics, a small modern miracle in the heart of the primeval swamp, had done their work. She watched him sleep, the harsh, guarded lines of the soldier erased from his face, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. A wave of profound, overwhelming love washed over her, so powerful it was a physical ache in her chest. This was her man, her partner, her soldier. The shared crucible of the last few days had burned away everything that was non-essential, leaving only the pure, unbreakable alloy of their connection. When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, the first thing he saw was her face, watching over him. He saw the deep exhaustion etched there, but he also saw the fierce, unwavering strength that had gotten them through the night. He reached up, his hand gently touching her cheek. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet wonder. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, the simple words a vow, a promise as solid and enduring as the ancient cypress tree at their backs. They moved on, their pace still slow, but their spirits renewed. Damon was weak, but the fever was gone, and his strength hour by hour began to return. Amara now walked point, taking the lead, her senses sharpened by her long night's vigil. She had learned to read the subtle language of the swamp, and she moved with a new, quiet confidence. They were a team, a true partnership, each compensating for the other's weakness, each drawing strength from the other's presence. They followed the faint, almost invisible animal trails that Damon seemed to know by instinct, their progress marked by the position of the sun and the flow of the water. The swamp, which had been their prison, was now their shield, a vast green fortress that protected them from the world of men and machines that was hunting them. Late in the afternoon of the second day of their trek, they found it. A small, dilapidated fishing shack, perched on stilts at the edge of a wide, slow-moving bayou. It was half swallowed by vines and tilting at a precarious angle, but it was a sign of civilization, a sign that they were nearing the edge of the wilderness. They approached the shack with a soldier's caution, circling it, watching for any sign of life. It was deserted, had been for years. Inside, it was a time capsule of a life abruptly ended. A rusted lantern sat on a dusty table, a half-eaten can of beans on the counter, a faded calendar on the wall showing the year 1987. But in the corner, leaning against the wall, was a treasure more valuable than gold. A long, narrow pirogue, the traditional flat-bottomed canoe of the bayou, its cypress wood aged but still sound, and two hand-carved paddles. Their journey on foot was over. The bayou, Damon explained, pointing on his map, was a straight shot north, a watery highway that would take them directly to the rendezvous point. They spent the rest of the day making the pirogue seaworthy, patching a small crack with pine resin they found on a nearby tree, their hands working together in a familiar, comfortable rhythm. As dusk fell, they launched the small, graceful boat into the black water. Damon, his strength now largely returned, took the stern, his powerful paddle stroke sending them gliding silently through the water. Amara sat in the bow, a lookout, her shotgun resting across her lap. They were moving again, with a new speed, a new hope. They were on the final leg of their journey. They paddled all night, the rhythmic dip and pull of the paddles a steady, hypnotic beat. The bayou was a tunnel of darkness, the stars above them a brilliant, scattered field of diamonds in a sky untouched by city lights. They spoke very little, their energy focused on the task, their companionship a deep, unspoken thing. As the sky began to lighten with the promise of a new day, they saw it. A small, rickety wooden dock, almost hidden in a grove of willow trees, and tied to the dock, a nondescript, mud-splattered pickup truck, identical to the one they had abandoned. Standing beside the truck was a man. He was a wiry, older Cajun, with a face like a weathered road map and watchful, intelligent eyes. He saw them approach and raised a hand in a slow, casual wave. This was Damon's contact, the first friendly face they had seen in what felt like a lifetime. The man, whose name was Antoine, greeted them with a grunt and a nod, his eyes taking in their filthy, exhausted state without comment. He handed Damon a set of keys and a brown paper bag. "Truck's fueled," he said, his voice a gravelly Cajun drawl. "Food's in the bag. You got a 2-hour head start before the morning shift change on the bridge patrols. Don't waste it." He looked at Amara, a flicker of curiosity and respect in his eyes. "You take care of this one, he said to her. "He's one of the good ones." With that, he untied his own small fishing boat, and with a pull of the starter cord, he disappeared down the bayou, a ghost melting back into the swamp. The new truck smelled of stale cigarette smoke and gasoline, the most beautiful smell in the world. They were back in the world of roads and engines. They crossed the Mississippi River on a high, soaring bridge, just as the sun was rising. The city of New Orleans, a glittering, hazy skyline in the distance. They had made it. They had crossed the wilderness, had survived the storm, had outrun the hunters. They were in the heart of the city, anonymous, invisible in the morning rush hour traffic. Damon directed her to a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a street of small, well-kept houses and blooming magnolia trees. He had her park the truck and then led her on foot through a maze of back alleys and quiet side streets, his old instincts for urban operations taking over. Their destination was a small, unassuming bookstore, its windows filled with dusty, second-hand volumes. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and leather. A small, balding man in wire-rimmed glasses looked up from behind the counter. His eyes widened in recognition when he saw Damon. "My God," the man breathed. "I thought you were dead." This was David Chen, the journalist, the one honest man Damon trusted. Damon pulled the small waterproof pouch from his pocket. He took out the data drive, the small piece of plastic and silicone that had cost so much blood, and placed it on the counter. "Here's your story, David," David, Damon said, his voice raw with exhaustion and triumph. It's all there. The names, the bank records, the shipping manifests, everything. Chen picked up the drive as if it were a holy relic. What are you going to do now? He asked, his gaze shifting to Amara, who stood silently by the door, a fierce, protective guardian. Damon looked at Amara, and his face, for the first time since she had met him, was completely unguarded, stripped of all the soldier's hardness. It was filled with a profound, gentle, and all-consuming love. I'm going to start a new life, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Somewhere quiet, somewhere a man can just be. His part of the war was over. He had delivered the weapon. He had brought the truth to the light. The rest was up to the world. He walked over to Amara and took her hand. Come on, he said softly, let's go home. And Amara, who had lost her home, her business, and her entire world, knew exactly what he meant. Home was not a place. It was not a shack on the edge of the Gulf. It was here, standing beside this man, her hand in his, ready to face whatever came next. Together, your support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these memories, these powerful stories of love and resilience, will never be extinguished. Thank you for being a keeper of the flame.